Okay, so today we'll be talking about Chapter 4, Section 3, and the title of this is Struggling Toward Saratoga, one of the more significant battles of this war. And we're going to be talking about how tiny little colonial America went from getting their butts kicked by the most powerful empire on the planet to finally turning this around and convincing the British that it wasn't worth it, and winning this war and gaining our independence. Now, first off, the Battle of New York. The British decided to attempt to stop this rebellion by isolating New England with a blockade. During this blockade, 32,000 British regular soldiers and highly trained German mercenaries called Hessians took the city of New York, one of the largest cities in the colonies at this time, in the very same summer that we drafted the Declaration of Independence. So if you think about it, we celebrated with fireworks on the 4th, and then within a month, we lost our biggest city to the British. So it really was a precarious situation. Now, this was a major British victory early on in the war. Okay, we got Bunker Hill. We've got now the sack of New York by the British. So what allowed the British to win? And really, this type of battle plays to the British advantage. They had a larger army. They had a more highly trained force. The British Army had centuries of tradition and discipline and loyalty and patriotism. The American colonies had just formed their army within the past year or so. Yeah, I mean, they are. They're not quite the regulars that the British are. And what they found, what the American colonists found, was going toe-to-toe with the British was a very bad idea. And toe-to-toe, that old phrase, refers to this style of warfare, the Napoleonic style of warfare, where I'll show you an example of. The soldiers line up in a big fancy row, they take turns shooting at one another, and then whoever's left standing at the end. So toe-to-toe literally means I'm standing right beside my compatriots, and when ordered to fire, boom, and then when ordered to reload without moving, I reload. Takes about 2 to 3 minutes to reload. And then when ordered to fire, I fire. I do this in mass for a number of reasons that we'll look at in a moment. And that style of warfare was something that the British Army excelled at. But it required an extreme degree of courage. I mean, when you watch it on the clip, you're going to be like, that's insane. Why would they do this? There is a specific reason they do this that we'll look at in a moment. But again, to be able to stand and take the shot that might kill you without flinching requires an extreme degree of courage. Many of Washington's new recruits were killed in this battle. In fact, his entire army was forced to retreat to Pennsylvania.
I'm not going back.
No, I didn't expect you would. Gates is a damn fool. He spent too many years in the British Army. Going muzzle to muzzle with redcoats in open field. It's madness.
Oh! Make ready! Present!
This battle was over before it began.
These rustics are so inept. Nearly takes the honor out of victory. Nearly.
So, a few things from that scene that you just witnessed. American colonists, a new, inexperienced army, were attempting to go head-to-head with the British Army, one of the most powerful and disciplined empires on the planet. Now, that style of warfare you saw was the standard practice in Western European warfare and had been the standard practice ever since the introduction of the smoothbore musket, which changed the style of warfare from bows and arrows to gunpowder. Now, the smoothbore musket, if you've ever fired one, is a very inaccurate weapon. Individually, it is difficult to hit your target. It's equivalent to throwing a knuckleball in baseball if you're a pitcher. Knuckleball follows an erratic pattern. There's no telling where it's actually going to wind up. It makes it very difficult for the batter to hit the ball. But it also makes it difficult for the pitcher to hit the catcher. Because when the ball is thrown, when it leaves the pitcher's hand, it's not spinning. It's just wobbling. And that's how the musket ball came out of a smoothbore stock. They're not called rifles yet because rifling refers specifically to a design within the barrel that forces the ball to spin. That's where the term rifle comes from, is that spinning when the projectile leaves the barrel. Now, this musket, the ball could go anywhere. And so the only way it's effective in warfare is to line up all of your guys, point them in the general direction of the enemy, and to have the enemy standing at a stationary location, and to fire en masse. And then to reload en masse while the row behind you fires. And so the tactic is you fire, you take a knee, reload, the line behind you fires, and then ideally in a well-trained army, by the time your one group reloads, the other group has fired, and it's an effective exchange. But it requires a discipline on both sides because you have to stand without moving and take the hit that might kill you. Now, the only way this works, according to a Prussian general who excelled at this style of combat, he said, your soldiers must fear your officers more than they fear the enemy. And so the officers would stand behind the lines of soldiers with a pistol ready to kill the first man that ran. And so the soldiers knew there was a high possibility of death in this style of warfare, but there was a certainty of death if they ran. Now, battles like this taught the American colonists that toe-to-toe with the British was not the best idea. Meanwhile, Washington and his army have retreated back to Pennsylvania. And by the Christmas of the very same year that we wrote the Declaration of Independence, Washington had famously crossed the Delaware River into New Jersey and managed to surprise this German Hessian garrison and won a resounding victory at the Battle of Trenton. Now, as a result, the Americans took the garrison at Trenton. The American army had a great boost of morale. A lot of people thought, wow, we can win a major victory against the British. We can do this. We've been getting our butts kicked. A lot of soldiers were deserting. A lot of men had died in the first few battles. And now Washington managed to demonstrate that we could win battles. And that we could surprise the enemy and that we could beat them. And 8 days later, the Americans went on to win another battle just outside of Princeton called the Battle of Princeton against the British. But if you remember me telling you, the largest city in the colonies and the second largest city in the entire British Empire was the city of Philadelphia. Now, taking Philadelphia would be an extreme victory for the American colonists. Now, stationed at Philadelphia was the British general William Howe. Had already defeated Washington and the Colonials at Pennsylvania in the summer of '77. In fact, at Philadelphia, the British forces outnumbered the Continentals. And this time they were far better prepared. Washington won at Trenton because he took the enemy by surprise. But at this point, the British were ready. As a result of the Battle of Philadelphia, General Howe, the British general, took the U.S. capital at Philadelphia. There was no Washington, D.C. It didn't exist yet. The capital was in Philadelphia, our largest city. And now the U.S. capital was taken by the British. Textbook, How to Beat Your Enemy, take their capital. Now the British have our capital. And the Continental Congress was forced to flee. In fact, the fledgling Continental government had to run away. And the British Army was able to spend the winter of 1777 in the comfort of our largest city, stationed in American homes, living out the winter comfortably, while Washington's army had to spend a deadly winter at the emergency camp at Valley Forge. You see, all we had to do in this war was convince the British Empire that it wasn't worth the resources to keep this colony. We didn't have to conquer. We didn't have to invade London. We didn't have to send troops over 10,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean and invade England. But they did. They had to, for every reinforcement, send that individual from Britain 10,000 miles across the ocean, a 3-month voyage, and then supply them in an aggressive enemy state. And that makes it rather difficult. That was the tactical disadvantage that we had in Vietnam. And that's the tactical disadvantage that any country has in being the aggressor. Meanwhile, at Saratoga, perhaps one of our greatest victories in this war, the British General John Burgoyne was leading the British and their allies south from Canada. And Burgoyne at this point had seen an American Continental Army that had suffered defeat after defeat. Even our capital had been taken by this time. Our largest cities had been taken by the British at this time. And so if I were this General Burgoyne, I certainly would have underestimated the American Continentals. I might have thought this war on the conclusion. I might have thought it nearly over. And yet, Burgoyne at Saratoga lost repeatedly to the Continental Army. Washington is a hero. We revere him. We name stuff after him. We put his image all over the place because at our weakest moment, this man managed to hold this army together. General Howe's army was a bit too far away and was not able to reach Burgoyne's forces in time. And finally, Washington was able to wear down the larger British force. In fact, there were many cases of subversive tactics where Continental forces realized going toe-to-toe with the British was ineffective. It just wasn't going to work. And so there were a number of Continental forces using hit-and-run tactics. In fact, the whole movie, The Patriot, is based around some of these guerrilla groups that were using kind of non-traditional tactics in fighting this war. And finally, by the end of the battle, Washington had Burgoyne's forces entirely surrounded. His men were exhausted, were hungry and tired, and had suffered defeat after defeat. And so he surrendered. Saratoga is considered a major victory for the Americans in the Revolutionary War. Had we lost this battle, then Burgoyne perhaps would have been right, that it would have just been a matter of time before we finally surrendered. The results of this were that the British strategy in the war changed from invading the mainland to keeping their troops stationed around the coast. The Continentals saw that they could deal the British a severe defeat. And this actually helped boost morale. This helped recruitment. A large number of colonials started joining the army, started joining the revolution. British confidence was damaged. And the British government did begin to wonder whether or not it was worth it. In fact, this was the very same problem the Union Army will have in the American Civil War, is they would have to convince the Union population that it was worth it. And that's where, after Saratoga, Britain had the problem of convincing the British people that it was worth keeping this colony at such great cost. Also after Saratoga, France, longtime enemy of Great Britain, remember the French and Indian War, began to support America openly. They began to see the real possibility of an American victory in this war for independence. Without France's help, without Saratoga, we wouldn't have France's help. Without France's help, we would have eventually lost this war to a nation with far greater resources than our own. So Saratoga was huge. It was a pivotal moment in this war. Now, with the French helping us financially and by sending soldiers, as well as ships, as well as supplies, the French are going to help us win this thing. France was the first country to formally recognize America as a country and not as a colony of Great Britain. In fact, they signed a mutual defense treaty in February of 1778. So let me state that for the record. Without France's help, we would not have a country, which is why we go to their aid, which is why we consider them one of our great allies in the world. Now, France agreed that they would assist the United States and there would be no peace with Great Britain until Great Britain formally recognized the United States as an independent sovereign nation. Now, as I said, when the British took Philadelphia, this was more than just a defeat requiring a retreat of the Continental Army. It was actually a loss of our greatest city and our nation's capital at this time. And it meant that instead of spending the winter in comfort, these American patriots would have to spend the winter suffering. The Continental Army's winter camp was called Valley Forge. There were 10,000 American soldiers stationed there. Of these 10,000, more than 2,000 of them died from the cold and hunger. It was a winter just like this that cost Napoleon his campaign and his hopes of conquering Western Europe when he invaded Russia. He had an army of 100,000 called the Grand Army of the Republic when he invaded Russia. When he returned, there were less than 20,000 left. Others had starved, deserted, or froze to death through the Russian winter. Valley Forge was our Russian campaign. 2 out of every 10 American soldiers died this winter. Now, throughout the war, colonial soldiers faced a number of challenges. Of course, we had the basic challenges of remaining clothed. There were quite a few soldiers walking around barefoot. There were stories of colonial soldiers stationed at Valley Forge wrapping socks and rags around their feet because they didn't have shoes. Keeping fed, supplying an army is one of the most expensive things that a country can do. And the American colonies did not have a lot of resources. Finally, staying warm and healthy. Soldiers were often having to provide for their own housing and often forced to hunt and live off the land because there were not enough supplies to keep them going. And being forced to survive and fend for themselves while being asked to put everything on the line can break some people. In fact, after the war was over, our government did not have enough money to pay these soldiers. In fact, we paid them in land. My ancestor Burgess Witt fought in this war. And the new American government didn't have enough money to pay him. And so they gave him land right near where I grew up. That's why my family's from Coker Creek, Tennessee, because we were granted land, which, by the way, belonged to the Cherokees. So there was, my family's one of these frontiers people who fought in the war and then was given land that actually belonged to someone else because they didn't have money to pay them. And so keeping their spirits up was a big problem in this war. Next, financing the war. To get money, Congress sold bonds to investors. Wealthy Americans in our own country would loan the Continental government money, but also other countries. Spain was very helpful. It wasn't only France's help. Spain also loaned us a great deal of money, which we couldn't have won the war without. The Continental Congress also printed paper money, not backed by gold or any form of hard currency. And they printed an excess amount of money, which led to inflation. And this money wasn't worth very much. And so it caused rising prices on all consumer goods. So the war hurt the continental economy. There were very few factories in the United States at this time. In fact, our main purpose in the British Empire was to supply the British Empire with raw materials. So there weren't many factories at all because we purchased all of the manufactured goods we needed from Great Britain. And so most weapons that Continentals were using were coming from France or Spain. Yet Britain maintained a strong naval blockade against the American Continentals. And so every weapon that was being used by a Continental soldier had to get smuggled through this blockade. Now, of course, a number of people were engaged in profiteering. That means price gouging or selling scarce goods for profit. In fact, often officers would have to raise and recruit their own armies and find ways to keep them supplied. And again, the movie Patriot is a neat way to look at this. Mel Gibson plays an officer who forms his own company and supplies them and pays them individually. Now, we're almost done. Civilians. Many American continental men went off to fight in the war, leaving women and children behind at home. And many women went on to run businesses or factories or farms that their husbands or fathers had been running prior to the war. Many women actually went with the troops and helped. There's some pretty amazing stories. Look up Florence Nightingale, who assisted in the war. Look up women who served as medics or cooks or nurses in the war. Well, of course, the medical field was a lot more primitive at this time, but women did assist in surgeries and in many cases save a number of soldiers' lives. There were about 5,000 African Americans that served in the Continental Army, but most Native Americans stayed out of the conflict. I think they realized what happened after the French and Indian War when they chose sides. It ended badly for them.